Hello everyone, and welcome back to World of Warships Blitz with Terry. If you've been around here for a while, you know that I am extremely interested in the inner workings of the game, and I have my own set of theories how certain things, like the APCS skill or armor penetrations in general, are working. Now, I might just be somebody who spends a little bit of time thinking about these things, but there are people out there who spend a lot of time and energy on engineering, testing, and trying to wire apart all the inner workings of the game. And these are the amazing folks from the Combat Information Center. I will leave a link in the description to the Discord and all their resources. So absolutely, if you're into this sort of stuff, make sure that you follow them, check that out, watch the videos and all these things. But there has been a major update from Hiromi 2 days ago. And I think it's a good idea to go through that just to make you all aware of the amazing work that these guys have been doing and to make you aware of what they found out. So, without further ado, no longer beating around the bush, massive update to the Elite Ship database. And there are a couple of zingers in here. We have the over-penetration coefficient, the full penetration coefficients, and angles. Yes. So according to Combat Information Center, there is angle, or there are angle mechanics in Warships Blitz. Now, you might be as surprised as I am, because I used to say for the longest time that there weren't any. And this was based off information we actually got way back when from Wargaming. And it's entirely possible that this is either something new, or this was a mechanic that just wasn't supposed to be made public. But apparently there are angling mechanics. So let's look at these first, because that is exciting. So the statement from the CIC says, if you're wondering why you get random half-pens and bounces in general, there is a chance to half-pen when rounds impact at 45 to 60 degrees. And over 60 degrees is a chance to bounce. They don't know the percentages themselves, but there are no guaranteed bounces or guaranteed half-pens. It is somewhat copied from PC, so you can actually check out PC ship tooling for exact angles. So what does that mean in practice? Well, for those of you who haven't been around for too long, let's actually look at that a little bit more detail. If you are facing an enemy ship, it's about the positioning here. So right now, as you can see, I am somewhat angled towards this ship. So if that ship would shoot at me, or I would shoot at that ship in return, both of us are angled towards each other. The steeper the angle, so if I'm going to turn in more towards the enemy ship, like this, now I have a steeper angle. But what you've noticed as well is that I can't get my center or rear turrets to bear anymore, because they can't traverse that much, so they can't get on target, which means I now have a steeper angle, which means there is a higher chance, according to this new information, there is now a higher chance of shells actually bouncing off my ship. There are other advantages of angling in the game, and always have been, so we've never said angling is useless, but one of the advantages would be that I present less of a target, because the targeting ellipsis means that shells will land to my left or right. Whereas if I was to give a broadside, so let's turn a ship around and get a full broadside going, and you see, even with a relatively steep angle already, I can get all my guns on target. So there's not really any good reason for me to do this. But if I'm going to give a nice flat broadside here towards the enemy target, that means the angling mechanics of giving a chance of semi-penetrations or ricochets are reduced, and this doesn't apply anymore, because now I'm sitting full on broadside. It isn't quite as punishing as it is in games like PC or Legend, simply due to the fact that citadel damage modifiers here are nowhere near as high. Whereas on, say, Legends, if you give broadside to a battleship and you're in a cruiser, you can be, and will be, outright deleted by getting a couple of citadel hits that just blow up your ship. This doesn't quite happen in Blitz, because even for the largest guns in the game, the citadel modifiers aren't high enough that you can just easily one-shot ships. It still hurts, though, and it's still a fair amount of damage that you get done that way. But in general, what that means is not even more so than before, when you are facing enemy guns, don't put your broadside to the target, because you see, I can angle my ship in and I can still get all my guns on target. You see, I'm still having all my guns on target, but now I am actually presenting a much smaller target towards the enemy. And just now my guns are starting to come out of alignment, so I can slightly adjust. And this is as much angle as I need to give. This allows me to get all my guns on target, but the angle from the enemy ship against my armor is giving me the maximum benefit with what we have now as this new information in terms of potential bounces and semi-penetrations, in addition to the fact that I am not actually just sitting there catching all the shells, but there's a fair chance that some of the shells actually land left or right and don't do any damage at all. So after that bombshell, it gets even better, because we now actually have penetration values and the coefficients for over-penetrations and full penetrations. So starting out with the over-penetration mechanic, what is an over-penetration? An over-penetration means that your shell has enough power behind it that it punches through the enemy, through the target ship, and comes out the other side before the fuse can activate. Now, fuses there are different ways of doing these things, but generally a fuse needs to achieve a certain amount of armor penetration before it blows up. Because what you want to do, in just very, very brief and superficial and mostly wrong naval gunnery theory, what you want to do is you want the ship to explode, the shell to explode inside the enemy ship. So if you are shooting at a ship that has armor, you do not want the shell to explode on contact, because that means that, well, the armor has its full effect and deflects mostly the energy of the explosion towards the outside. What you want to happen instead is you want your shell to punch through the armor and then explode in the vulnerable insides of the enemy ship, because that does the maximum amount of damage. And there are various ways to achieving this, from different shapes to adding caps to the question of how is the armor structured in order to defeat these things. There are many variables in these sort of things. But an over-penetration effectively happens if the shell has so much penetration power that it goes through the armor, but then it doesn't penetrate enough in order to trip the fuse and to actually get the shell to blow up. So it just keeps going and punches out the other side again, which still makes a hole in a ship. So it's not that the ship gets away scot-free. It's just that the explosive charge inside the shell does not blow up in the ship, causing death and devastation, but rather you get a relatively clean hole coming in on one side, and you then punch through the inner workings, destroy whatever is in there by pure kinetic energy rather than the explosive energy of the shell, and then the shell goes out the other side again and gets back into the water. In the game, this is represented as an over-penetration, which will do as a 25% damage. So if your armor-piercing shell is supposed to do 1,000 points of damage and it over-penetrates, then your alpha damage gets reduced to 250, and then the regular protection and armor values are applied. So you do significantly less damage. Most obvious, this problem is most obvious if you are shooting large caliber shells, because many of the smaller caliber shells don't have enough firepower to overpenetrate. But if you fire large caliber armor piercing shells, all of this what we're talking about here applies mostly to armor piercing. If you have large caliber armor piercing shells, so let's say you're firing with a Yamato at a destroyer, most likely the armor piercing shells just have enough, just make a hole in the ship, but don't explode on the inside. So you're not actually doing an awful lot of damage. And this can get to the point that your secondaries, say on, for example, a German battleship or a battlecruiser, are actually more effective with their armor-piercing shells than the main guns with armor-piercing against very lightly armored targets. And this is also where the point of impact becomes interesting, because ships don't have uniform armor. Let's head over to the CIC website and I'll describe what I'm talking about here. Here we have the armor layout of the USS South Carolina, American Tier 3 battleship. It's similar with others, but you see that the bow and stern section both have 16 millimeters of plating, the deck has 50 millimeters, and the belt has 203 millimeters. So if you're hitting the bow and stern with a battleship caliber armor-piercing shell, there's a fair chance that the shell is actually just going to punch right through it and only do minimal damage. Whereas if you're hitting the deck, you're normally having a pretty good chance of doing full damage. Hitting the belt, there the armor actually kicks in and starts reducing your damage as well. But we are talking about the overpenetration mechanics here. So the overpenetration coefficient is 1/11 of the armor-piercing shell penetration. What is armor-piercing shell penetration? We know that this exists, and the Elite Ship database actually has these values now. So let's take a very quick look at that. Here we can see that the South Carolina's main guns have an initial penetration power of 223 millimeters. So that is the amount of armor that these things can punch. The armor-piercing penetration at maximum range is reduced and is only at 202 millimeters. So this is a mechanic that was known because of the APCS skill, because the APCS skill, the armor-piercing cap shell captain skill, actually reduces that drop-off. So the amount of penetration power that we're losing over flight time of the shell is reduced by the APCS skills. You get more penetration power impact as you go. So the over-penetration happens at 1/11 of the armor-piercing shell penetration. Not at the initial penetration, but at the penetration of impact. So it depends on how far away you are, which means every 660 meters, 1 millimeter of penetration is lost, and this is a linear loss. So effectively at muzzle, the shells have maximum penetration, but as you go, every 2/3 of a kilometer, you lose a millimeter of penetration. In this particular example, they're using Yamato. So Yamato has a 502 millimeter initial penetration or a 46 millimeter over penetration coefficient at point blank range, which means that given most battleships have a bow armor or stern armor at 32 millimeters, you will need to be a certain distance away. In the example of the Yamato, it's 9.24 kilometers. Because you have a 14 millimeter extra penetration that you need to lose in order to not over penetrate, and that is 9.24 kilometers by the respective drop off. This is without the commander skill. So if you're having the APCS skill, you need to be even further away to not over penetrate the bow or stern of an enemy battleship with a significant amount of firepower. Now, this is a completely different story if you are shooting with armor piercing from a battleship at, say, a destroyer. So with our Yamato example here, we'd still have significantly more firepower on the armor piercing than a gearing class destroyer, for example, does even have as belt armor. So that's sort of the example that they're using here. And sort of as a rule of thumb, they're suggesting to use 1/10 of 1/10 of the caliber. So 460 millimeter caliber on the Yamato, 46 millimeter penetration at point blank, which means that then in order to not over penetrate battleship's bow or stern, you need to be at least 9.2 kilometers away. To not over-penetrate a destroyer's belt armor, you need to actually know what the values for these is. And in the example of the gearing, given that the gearing has such paper-thin armor, you'd have to be 16.5 kilometer away for that to happen. So, of course, then that is without the APCS skill. So then once you have that in, it gives you extra 10% power sustainability, so it gets even worse. Do you need to remember all of this? No. Rule of thumb, if you're shooting if you want to study these values and try to memorize them, it'll help you. But I doubt that anyone's going to keep in mind what the particular armor values are at all the ships that they're encountering, especially if you're playing multiple tiers, right? So personally, I play because I grind different lines and I just like playing different ships. I play different tiers, but if you're always playing the same ship and you're always playing the same tier, so let's say you're playing 20 rounds a day in the Yamato, then it actually can be helpful to go through the ship database, to study the armor values of your targets, to create yourself a cheat sheet and sort of get a rough idea how far away you have to be before you switch to high explosive to not over-penetrate. For everybody else, don't use large caliber armor-piercing shells at destroyers unless you're firing at long ranges. So as you can see here with the Yamato, basically above 10 kilometers, you might be lucky. Everything else, not so much. So onwards to the final piece of the news, the full penetration, half penetration, and bounce values. So it appears that, according to CIC, the thresholds are 100% full penetration if the armor at target is less than 1/3 of the shell's penetration. Obviously, if you have too little armor, you're over-penetrating again. So let's look at that a little bit in practical terms. For example, the Yamato's shells, as we've taken that as an example, have a penetration at maximum range of 465 millimeters, which would mean that less than one third of that would be 155 millimeters. So it would mean that no deck armor on the target would be impervious to Yamato shells, and you would always get full penetrations. I'm not sure if these values are 100% correct, because at least my gut feeling would tell me that I might have seen bounces. The problem is you can't easily observe that, because it's entirely possible that the shell falls a little bit short and actually is hitting the belt armor. And if we're looking at the belt armor values, then all battleships at tier have significantly more than 150 millimeters of armor. So how about the rest of the values? So if we are less than half of the shell's penetration at impact, then we get 50% full pens and 50% half pens. And that sounds a little bit more reasonable. It's still not quite going to work against battleship belt armor, but generally this is extremely exciting, because it gives us a really good insight into how this distribution is working, and also the rest of the scale. So if you have equal armor value to the penetration, which for example on the Yamato shells is not going to work, then you get 100% semi-pens. I have seen this when firing at battleships, definitely. So even with a Yamato, so there has to be still some form of tweaking, because I have seen salvos that were 100% semi-pens, and they would have hit a belt armor of a battleship. It might be more of a sliding scale, or we might be looking at a factor here. So anywhere between half the shell's penetration and equal to the penetration would give us 100% half pen. And then so on and so forth. If you have twice the armor of the shell's penetration, so obviously for lighter shells, then you get 50% semi-pens and 50% bounces. And then 100% bounces if you have triple the armor of the shell's penetration. So that makes a lot of sense. And again, this is for each shell individually, depending on where it impacts. What is the practical impact of that? It's not huge. So the old rules still apply. I would say for 99.9% of the players, observe what your shells are doing. If you're firing battleship on battleship armor piercing, try to hit the deck if you can, because the belt you're likely not going to penetrate reliably, and the bow and stern you're going to be over penetrating reliably. If you're firing cruisers, it might get a lot more interesting. So for example, I'd be curious to see what the penetration values are for something like a Hindenburg or for a Des Moines, and see at which point I can reliably full penetrate a battleship's deck plating, because that's an interesting thing to know, because you can potentially score citadels if you get full penetrations through the deck, whereas if you are firing at bow stern with the 203 millimeters, you're most likely not over penetrating, but unless you're getting too close. So it's a little bit more of a guesswork and an experience factor. So for new players, again, don't take it too seriously. Just the most important rule, don't give broadside. That is generally a good idea. unless you are against battleships, that is. If you are interested and you're playing frequently at a single tier, especially at top tiers, I can imagine this becoming more interesting. So tier 10 is probably the most interesting one for these values, because a lot of people play at some point relatively exclusively at tier 10. It can actually be valuable to do a bit of a cheat sheet and calculate for your favorite ships at which points you can switch between high explosive and armor piercing, and at which point you can switch between bow stern and deck targeting and these kind of things. So can make a difference in a battle. It definitely can. Not as much as the don't broadside rule, but it can. Again, I am absolutely loving this, that we finally get insights into how these game mechanics are working. And CIC is going to be hard at work trying to refresh all the values and get everything tested and get penetration calculators and all this kind of stuff going. So I find this hugely exciting, and at the very least, it dispels a little bit the conception that Warships Blitz is just a simple arcade shooter. It isn't. So knowing your ship, knowing your enemy, will make the difference between you winning an engagement and you losing an engagement. So even though the punishment for not respecting these values isn't as severe as on PC, it still is there. And in a 1v1 scenario, this can make all the difference. Anyway, that's all I have today. Thanks everybody, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.